Good morning. Welcome back to Ripped from the Headlines, our 2026 edition. And this morning, we're going to look at a headline I saw a couple of weeks ago, which could be on the radar screen right now as a new year begins and a new legal year begins in New York State, in Albany, as well as something that's been, to some extent, percolating for over a year. As you may know, I always encourage people to send topics that they read about for consideration to look at from the lens of this class. And I keep a list. And when I saw this headline, you see in source number one from a couple of weeks ago, the New York governor will sign the right to die bill for the terminally ill. This all built upon a couple of headlines that I have from November 2024 as a law was being debated and discussed and voted on in England. And so, for those, I'm guessing those of us who are old enough to remember Dr. Death, right, Jack Kevorkian, back, the 80s and 90s, this idea of the right to die or physician-assisted suicide is something that has been on the topic of discussion for a while. And when I saw this headline a couple of weeks ago, decided time to tackle it, especially if Hochul is going to sign it. It's going to be signed in the new year, and that could be any minute now. So let's dive right in to some of the discussion. Governor Kathy Hochul announced on Wednesday that she would sign a bill that will allow terminally ill New Yorkers to end their lives, speaking in unusually personal terms as she settled an emotional decade-long battle between religious leaders and right-to-die advocates. The law will apply to adults who have incurable, irreversible illnesses and 6 months or less to live. Each patient will need the sign-off of 3 doctors. 12 states, the District of Columbia, and several countries in Europe have passed similar laws over the objections of some disability rights advocates and religious organizations, most notably the Catholic Church, which characterizes the bill as legally assisting suicide. The bill provides for a 5-day waiting period to offer applicants time to change their minds. The measure will take effect 6 months after it is signed, though a small number of waivers will be made available for those who need to make use of the law sooner. Mental illnesses do not qualify. Any hospital that does not want to participate for religious reasons will not be required to, Ms. Hochul said. So you have, even right from the get-go, it's kind of, I don't know about you, but reviewing the article, the information, 6 months or less to live. How does that actually work? 6 months or less to live. How can that be quantified? Generally, in my experience, doctors are never that precise or specific in terms of analyzing this, but that's one of the issues that emerges. Now, the fact that this is something that's been an emotional roller coaster for Hochul herself, and she spoke about it in personal terms. You could see the article, for specifically the experiences that she's referring to, but it's something that, is something that the emotional aspect to is something that is not to be underestimated, and we will see that as well. So on the religious side, continuing in the article, Ms. Hochul, who is Catholic, said it was one of the most difficult decisions she faced as governor. She wrote an essay published Wednesday morning.
Hey, Rabbi.
Union. Yes. Hello. The Albany Times Union, that she had listened to people suffering through the agony of a slow death. And that these painful experiences mirrored her own observations of a beloved family member. The governor, a Democrat, said that she had struggled with the Catholic teaching on the measure. There's a lot of religious conflict in me, the way I was raised, she said on Wednesday. But I realize it's not about me, it's about 20 million New Yorkers. She also finds faith-related reasons to support the bill. I do not believe that in every instance condemning someone to excruciating pain and suffering preserves the dignity and sanctity of life, she wrote in the essay. She added, I was taught that God is merciful and compassionate, and so must we be. In a statement on Wednesday, New York State Catholic Conference called the state bill, the Medical Aid in Dying Act, egregious, and said that it signaled the state's abandonment of its most vulnerable citizens. The church opposes assisted suicide euthanasia, which the Vatican has called intrinsically evil. Suffice it to say, Jewish organizations were similarly opposed. a lot of the Jewish public opposition and statements emerged after the bill was passed back in August, as well as efforts to lobby the governor not to sign it. I guess it hasn't been signed yet, but she said she's going to sign it, and so we have this issue. And there are a number of terms that are always lumped together, right? This is called the Medical Aid in Dying Act. Is this euthanasia directly, a physician-assisted suicide? In general, it's something that Judaism is very much opposed to, because Judaism, the declaration is uvacharta b'chayim, you should choose life, and suicide is addressed as a violation of Torah and commandments. It's viewed as a violation of the 7 Noachide universal commandments. Ending life is something that also touches upon the topic that we've spoken about previously with regards to abortion and the connections there. But comments and reactions to this article, and we're not doing it because there's a gubernatorial election in November 2026, in which many of us know the Republican candidate. Nothing to do with this morning's topic. But so any comments, questions, reactions before we tackle some of the Jewish sources from a religious perspective, and maybe even kind of the emotional aspect as well. Okay, so this could be a very short presentation because Judaism is opposed to this, right? There's no, the opposition very much in terms of the, similar to the Catholic Church in terms of seeing this as wrong, as improper, and really any of the discussions of this topic from a halachic perspective, have to grapple with that proactively ending a life is viewed as forbidden. Source number 2, Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah 345:1. One who commits suicide willfully is not attended to at all, and one does not mourn for him, and no lamentation is made for him, nor does one rend garments or bear the shoulder in mourning for him, but one stands for him in the line of comforters, and one recites over him the mourner's blessing, and whatever brings honor only to the living may be done. This idea, and this something that definitely has crept into Jewish cultural awareness, is that you don't have a funeral or sit shiva for someone who commits suicide, and that's emerging from this statement, the idea of not mourning the person. However, there is concern for those left behind, as the Shulchan Aruch ends. Whatever brings honor only to the living may be done, and there's this idea that the person who has committed suicide has, in a certain sense, removed themselves from being treated like every other person. It's this is that line of distinction. This idea of a person who decides to end their own life is viewed as having there are lots of sins, but this one seems to be the worst possible one in terms of not being, as we've seen in other contexts, the role that the role that death plays on ritual, the role that death plays on religious observance and the religious sentiment and feeling. We know the role that Yizkor plays and Kaddish plays, and here someone who commits suicide is kind of cut off from that, while we still have sympathy for the ones left behind. So Rabbi Yechiel Michal Tukachinsky, who wrote a classic work on mourning and death and afterlife and all sorts of things, called Gesher HaChayim, literally translates as the bridge of life. So his discussion of suicide, source number 3, the sin of one who murders himself is greater than that one who murders someone else for several reasons. First, through his murder, he left no possibility for any remorse and repentance. Second, death is the greatest form of repentance, but he, on the contrary, has committed through his death the greatest sin, namely murder. Third, through his act, he has made clear his repudiation of his creator's ownership of his life, his body, and his soul. He has denied the simple idea that he did not participate in his creation at all, but thinks rather that his entire identity is exclusively within his power to sustain, to reproduce his existence, or to destroy it. It's a theological offense. He's like one who actively and intentionally burns a Torah a scroll of the Torah. For sages, may their memory be blessed, compared the creation of the soul to a scroll of the Torah that now has been burned, and he must therefore face judgment in the future for this as well. He is also among the unequivocal deniers of the continued existence of the soul and of the existence of the Creator, may his name be blessed, and for the future judgment after the departure of the soul from the body. By taking the law into his own hands, he seems to be denying everything else that's connected, although one could say that just because he decides to end his own life doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't believe in an afterlife. He's trying to escape this world. But there does seem to be this extremely negative connotation that it's part and parcel, not just of ending one's life, which is within the murder context, a murder bundle of sins, but there's also a theological offense so strong that it's denying Torah and denying God himself. And as we will see, as with other aspects, when we start invoking theological heresy and the like, Judaism will have to grapple with certain cases, some biblical, some rabbinic and traditional, of what happened when people do decide to end their lives. So, for example, there's a very famous example in Shmuel Aleph, the story of Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, who ended his life. Source number 4, the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, sons of Saul. The battle raged around Saul, and some of the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archer. Saul said to his arms bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, so that the uncircumcised may not run me through and make sport of me. Kill me, so they don't capture me, and either kill me or even mock me." But his arms bearer and his great awe refused. "What do you mean, kill you? I can't kill you." Whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. "Okay, you can't kill me." So Saul killed himself. When his arms bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. When he saw that, not only did Saul commit suicide, but his actions, quote unquote, inspired the other person, "Hey, I'm going to commit suicide too." So there's a lot to unpack from this famous story, this precedent. Any reactions to how this story may complicate or expand our discussion of suicide, or to bring in any other cases of suicide within the Jewish tradition, maybe not as explicitly mentioned as this one in Tanakh, that could expand the conversation. So, one, it could be that Saul was on his way out, right? He had been injured. Maybe he was about to die anyway. Maybe there is a point that ending one's life when one has been mortally wounded, maybe it's not so terrible. Second, can there be mitigating circumstances of what will happen if one doesn't commit suicide? Here's the king about to be captured by the enemy. Can possibly bring to mind some of the other stories that we are familiar with. You have the story of Masada in the Jewish tradition. Yeah. You have the stories of even in the Talmud of the destruction of the Second Temple, of the Kohanim, or the young people killing themselves rather than fall to be slaves to the Romans. Or we just finished the Hanukkah story, the story of Yehudit, of Judith. Right? There is a rabbinic literature on some of these in the Midrash and the Talmud that maybe there are mitigating circumstances. And so I think that we need to explore a little bit more this idea of what about when one comes to the end, one's life is compromised, whether you call one's quality of life or technically one's ability to live, like Saul being shot with the arrows, his life is draining away. Maybe that's a little bit different than a normal situation. And maybe that does, touch upon this discussion, as we saw in particular New York's law, which only have 6 months to live, as well as there being mitigating circumstances in terms of when one is afraid of what would happen if one doesn't die right now, what that leads to, and that may open up the mental well-being situation. For example, Tosfot in Gittin 57b, source number 5, which is talking about that situation that Hirsch mentioned just in the chat, and could also apply to some of the other examples of Masada or during the Crusades, right? They of those who decided, the young women who jumped into the sea. So Tosfot asked the question, but wait a second. End of the day, don't we have to defer to God who grants life? It's up to God. God gives us life. God decides when we die. So Hacha Yireim Hayu Miyasurim. Maybe here they were worried about what would happen to them. They couldn't fathom. They didn't want to. They did not want to live to see what might happen to them. They were afraid of how they might be tortured or abused. As the Talmud says elsewhere about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that were thrown into the furnace, right? That they were scared. How you right? They were worried how you ma'ananos and they were worried that they would face torture and not death, and that torture would be worse than death. So there may be mitigating circumstances, and suffice it to say that rabbinic literature is not so definitive that Masada, and we're not really sure what happened in Masada. They killed themselves. We don't know. There's different archaeological finds. How long were the Romans sieging and the like? But the episodes that are recounted in the first Crusades of people killing themselves, right? We don't know what they may have had to suffer and to go through, and how that might make a difference in terms of that might be a mitigating circumstance. Here, the rabbis, here's Tosfot explaining how it was understood that it doesn't, not necessarily approving, but how could they even think to do so? And this idea of what might be going through the mind of those who commit suicide factors into Jewish law in a way that, in a sense, moderates or modifies the implementation of what we saw in source number 2 in terms of no shiva or no mourning or no proper burial for those who commit suicide. Because the Aruch HaShulchan, writing in the turn of the 20th century, when analyzing the scenarios of what happens if, sadly, unfortunately, someone takes their own life, he says, Klalo shel davar, at the end of the day, b'ma'abed atzmo ladas, someone who commits suicide, talinan b'chol ezet liyakoshu. We try and find any type of defense or excuse or rationale that we can. Kigon litlos biyira o bitzar. Maybe it was fear or pain or anguish, or sheyatze midato, or mental illness. Maybe, like the cases in the Talmud, they were avoiding other sins, right? Normally, we would say, Yehareg v'al Yavor v'al Yehareg. You shouldn't be. It's okay to commit sins if your life is being threatened, except for the 3 cardinal sins. Maybe the person thinks that it's better to die than to be subject to the potential to violate commandments. All these types of rationales. Because it just boggles the mind that anyone would ever willfully commit suicide. Let's add, considering what Rabbi Kaczynski says about being completely denying everything about Judaism, everything about Torah, everything about God. And he says, look at Saul. He killed himself. And all these types of situations, right? Certainly if it's someone who's younger, right? We basically, the term in halachic literature for suicide is ma'abed atzmo ladas. Purposefully causes himself to be lost, kills himself. We just look at it, if someone commits suicide, we don't look at it as if it was willful. So, and this is definitely something that colors, that shades application of Jewish law today. So, for example, you may have heard the idea that if someone, sadly, God forbid, commits suicide, by the time the time they actually died, the life left them, they regretted it. You may have heard something like that. That's an extension or a corollary of this Aruch HaShulchan. So there is a recognition that this is by no means meant to bolster or support or endorse any type of physician-assisted suicide or the New York law or the other states that have the law. Interestingly enough, if you look up the states, I think they're all Democratic govern the states except Montana. Interesting. Maybe it's kind of like, the libertarianism there that people should be able to do whatever the heck they want. Don't know. But you have this, suicide is a terrible violation. It's a religious, legal, theological heresy, but it happens. And maybe it happens because of the turmoil that the person faces, whether it's real or imagined. Another corollary that mitigates the conversation. So when the Rambam is describing, obviously it's prohibited to kill. So when the Rambam is discussing murder and those who kill, source number 7, whether a person kills a healthy person, a sick person who's on the verge of dying, or even a person who's actual death throes, the killer should be executed. Right? You can't say, oh, that person was about to die and I killed them, so that should be a reason to mitigate the crime. However, if one kills a person in his death throes because of the wounds inflicted upon him by others, i.e. was stricken until he was on the verge of death, he's in his death throes, the killer should not be executed by the court. Sometimes that, if that person was, life hanging in the balance for an outside reason, and if a person kills that person, the murderer is not really subject to execution. So there's a recognition that killing someone who has had something done to them that was not the fault of the killer, that killer is a killer, but not a murderer to be subject to execution. There's something to be said that at the end of life, when a person is fill in the blank, whether it's a terminal illness or whether it's having been beaten to within an inch of their life, there is something different at the end of life. And this does impact how we view end of life, and it's another conversation in terms of types of how we view the end of life, and something that has come up before in other classes. But, like, for example, and the Ramah captures the halachic conclusion of this, right? That you're not allowed to hasten anyone's death, but if there is something that delays the soul's departure, one may remove it, but one may not do anything that hastens death. So this is the idea when we talk about end of life. What types of treatments have to be utilized, what type of treatments can be avoided, and which ones can be suspended. It's a very complex subject, and every case can be different, right? For the most part, there's certainly a generalization you might be familiar with that. If a person, you don't have to necessarily take invasive procedures. Someone who is has unfortunately a terminal illness and maybe would be qualified by the doctors as having less than 6 months to live, and they need a kind of minor ancillary surgery, otherwise something will happen that will worsen the condition. You don't have to do the minor parallel procedures in order to fend off what might happen, especially if a person is terminal. Or for certain types of interventions don't have to be taken. Different types of medications don't have to be provided if it's not going to necessarily hasten death. But if you withhold those medications, maybe it will allow nature to take its course. And there are precedents of this in the Talmud, not of course of medical technology, but certain types of certain scenarios. For example, the very famous one is in the Gemara in Ksubos, where Rebbe was sick, and Rebbe's housekeeper was praying for him to survive. And there was a sense that those prayers were keeping him alive, whether spiritually, religiously, whether giving him hope. And the woman was distracted to stop praying, and he passed away. Well, she wasn't doing it. It was the idea of something that was helping keep him alive. That was, again, you didn't do anything to hasten death, but it was something that was delaying the soul's departure. And this comes up. The idea of not necessarily starting different types of treatment, but you're not allowed to, for example, starve a person, because that definitely will lead to them dying. And if anyone's looking for interesting material on this matter, there's an organization called Ematai, Ematai, I believe, not Ematai, Ematai, led by Rabbi Shlomo Brody, who's an expert on this subject, and we'll actually see some of his comments on the subject our subject in a minute, but it's a very complex subject, an important one. Relates to certain issues like DNRs and medical directives, which are important to think about and not wait for the last minute. Not a happy subject, but certainly one worth investigating. And that's what we're recognizing, both from the culpability of killing someone at the end of their life, of course forbidden, but recognizing that the end of the life is not the same as a full life, as well as what needs to be done. At some point, you don't have to prolong life unnecessarily. That also impacts the conversation from a Jewish perspective. It's important to point these factors out while still recognizing how Jewish law would be very much against any of these laws, like the New York State law or the British law, which we'll explore some of the opposition in a minute. Not just the halachic, but also the moral and ethical issues which should be considered, and the fact that rabbis are making these moral and ethical arguments in addition to the religious arguments highlight the complexity of the subject and the sensitivity towards it. Questions, comments, reactions before we look at some of those reactions. In particular, like I said, we'll be looking at them as they relate towards the British law, but I think there's a similar resonance here as well.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
If a person commits suicide, is that considered criminal behavior on his part?
So the short answer would be yes. The longer answer is we would try to find a way to excuse that behavior and see it as it was, not wanting it to. Not we don't. On the one hand, the action would be viewed as a criminal or a forbidden activity, while at the same time we would try to find some way to excuse it so it wouldn't be as blatantly criminal. And that's kind of what we saw from even from King Saul. He committed suicide, but it wasn't that he committed suicide because he wanted to die or wanted to deny God as creator and the like. He had mitigating circumstances.
Complicated issue.
Well, that's as with many things. There's the technical, legal. There's the emotional, and then there's the practical. So for sure.
So Rabbi.
Yeah.
Louise here, Wheezy. Ruth. Anyway, so, I think it's where do you want to draw the line? My mom was given 6 to 9 months to live at the age of 79.
Mm-hmm.
And she had been in every center court and so many different arenas. And she turned around. She goes, 6 to 9 months, that's a hell of a long time. I'm living. And
Right.
the doctor said, if I give you chemo, you could live maybe another 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice at that time is 5 years of sick, not knowing, or 6 to 9 months of living. So her next question was, will you take care of my pain? And he said, of course we'll take care of your pain. And we ran a bucket list. She has 4 kids in 4 years. We ran a bucket list. Every month we all got together and jumped out of planes, swam with dolphins, air glided. We did so many wonderful things. We created a nest for the family that we could all hold together when she died at exactly between 6 to 9 months with only really one bad day.
Mm.
And I have to say, the question is, where do you want to draw the line? Is it going to be God's line when he lets you run that course? Or is it going to be man's line, which is going to be technology? Or is it going to be your line when you decide how you're going to exit this song? And that's my feeling about death. You've got to accept it as part of life.
Well, I think that man versus nature, the doctor, as we say about the Jewish approach to doctors, is God heals, the doctor takes the fee.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
I think we're now after presenting that there is this move towards taking the matter and the law and the decision into our own hands, right? That's the decision, and recognizing, and Hochul points out she's conflicted, and there's religion, and even though there's a religious opposition, there still seems to be a mitigating factor, God's mercy, and we see how it with regards to Catholic Church and Judaism are of similar minds while recognizing there could be mitigating factors, at the end of the day, this is something that goes against how we view religiously and Jewishly view life and God's role and our role in the world. Now we're going to diffuse it a little bit into the moral and ethical, and recognize that, and I think we'll see this in particular with Chief Rabbi Mervis from England, that it's not. There's clearly, every case is different. It's hard to say. It's easy to point out what the Jewish sources say about the subject, how it's forbidden and how it might be mitigated, and at the end of the day, we're opposed. At the same time, when we're dealing with individuals and human lives and human decisions, that's something that can't be that can't be imposed. So let's look at some of that, the ethical and the moral issues, some of them that are not just about personal but also about communal and social. So I mentioned before Rabbi Shlomo Brody from Eimatai. And so this was, you can see, like I mentioned at the beginning, this was back in November 2024 when this was voted in England. British medical care is on the verge of radical change unless Jews join other activists to stop Parliament from passing the terminally ill adults bill. Unfortunately, some have presented the debate over physician-assisted suicide as being between progressives in favor of liberty against religious traditionalists opposing change. Rabbi Jonathan Romaine, for example, told this newspaper that opposition from Orthodox Jews in the Anglican Church stems from using an ancient criterion for a modern problem. It's simply no longer applicable. In fact, the law should be opposed by all citizens of good conscience because of well-founded concerns for dangerous consequences. Let's review the evidence. Proponents of the bill claim that supervising doctors will ensure that patients are aware of other treatment options, including palliative and hospice care. Such promises ring hollow when palliative care is woefully underfunded. Already now, there's a lack of palliative specialists in beds to alleviate the suffering of the terminally ill. Naturally, those who are most likely not to receive the adequate care are society's most vulnerable citizens, the poor, the disabled, the elderly, and the infirm. These groups already have too many barriers to getting treatments that can help them live out their lives with dignity. Now, a new, tempting, cheap, and quick option will be dangled before them. For this reason, a large group of secular human rights organizations have come out strongly against the bill. The argument is straightforward. Evidence from around the world shows that assisted suicide laws have harmed the weakest members of our society. So you have kind of a social dynamic at play that, if you there are other options that could enhance the quality of life at the end of life, but those are not so available. So then a more straightforward path can be taken. To me, this rings or resonates a little bit with the conversation that Brody is now saying. Society has to be better at offering these alternatives to everybody in order to prevent them from choosing, quote unquote, the easiest option of ending their lives, because finding the hospice or the palliative care or having access to it or affording it is too challenging. So society has to make them available. To me, it sounds a little bit like, when they have the discussion on the abortion issue between pro-choice and pro-life, that the idea of, opposing abortion or saying no to abortion might be easier if there were better ways for, those who found themselves in unwanted pregnancies to deal with it. Whether it be, better ways for people to keep their children, or whether it be promoting adoption or ways that carry the child to term and finding ways forward, right? They're quote unquote harder and heavier, but these are options. And this is really, it becomes, if you really want people to be more quote unquote pro-life, then you have to make life better. And I think Brody is offering kind of a similar approach here, right? The idea of, that this physician-assisted suicide as an out is because all the other options are not necessarily as available. If you had all of the options to in front of you equally accessible, that would be easier. But if they're not equally accessible, then choosing to die might be the option most accessible or most easily taken. And, he points out from a Jewish perspective, Jews have always taken pride in our commitment to medical care alongside with protecting society's most vulnerable citizens. Terminally ill bill will initiate a social experiment that has proven to be immoral and ineffective. If it passes, it will become nearly impossible to turn back the clock. Both reason and religion teach us to stop this from happening. The idea that once you let the genie out of the bottle, it becomes hard to stop. Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis takes this a little bit further. He started, from his statement that he published also last November. In our daily prayers, Jews declare our belief that the soul given to us by God is pure, and He instills it within us, and that eventually He will take it from us at the right time. Right? This is Elokai Neshama prayer that's part of the morning services. We believe that life is a sacred gift bestowed upon us by God, and that should always be treasured as such. Right? So he's coming from a more spiritual perspective rather than a legal perspective. Yet I readily acknowledge Lord Falcone's recent assertion that a minority religious perspective should not be imposed upon others. In my view, this is an issue which transcends the concerns of faith communities. It presents a fundamental moral challenge to our society, which I believe should trouble people of all faiths and none, approaching it from a similar perspective as Brody. Whilst, of course, I would not presume to dictate to a person suffering unbearable pain at the end of their life, recognizing that it's very emotional, very personal. Ahead of the parliamentary debate about a bill which could be among the most consequential of our time, I feel a moral obligation to express deep concerns about its implications. The granting of a right to end one's own life would simultaneously pose a new and immeasurable pressure upon terminal patients who are already extremely vulnerable. Placing before a person the ultimate choice between life and death calls for a decision which simply cannot be protected against all manner of external influences, regardless of the proposed safeguards. Right? Maybe being in a situation where all of a sudden the opportunity to make that decision is there will likely, for Mervis, lead to there being a situation that a decision has to be made in a less than pristine environment. Hospitals pressuring terminal patients to make that decision. Hospitals have a lot of self-interest. Patient has his own self-interest. How does it get balanced? It becomes unfair. So the way the Brody presented the economic disparity that this may lead, and Mervis is mentioning the personal pressures that a person may face once this is on the books and becomes an option. Over the years, I have heard countless heartrending stories of those desperate to take control of the end of their lives and to end their suffering by ending their lives. No decent person could fail to be moved by their experiences, yet my appeal to you is on behalf of those whose stories will never be heard, those who will never let it be known that if not for the emotional, financial burden that they felt they had become, they might just choose life. So then touching upon the theme that Brody mentioned as well. So you have the halachic, you have the idea of the sanctity of life, and you also have certain economic, moral, and social issues that make this more complicated. And then essentially, letting the genie out of the bottle on a societal level is not good for society. Reactions, comments before looking at kind of another aspect of this.
Yeah, Rabbi, I have one comment on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
This man went to a doctor, and the doctor said, Sam, I'm sorry to tell you, you only have 6 months to live. That'll be $500. So Sam said, $500? I don't have $500. So the doctor says, all right, I'll give you another 6 months.
So that's exactly highlights the economic pressures that are faced here. Sometimes,
right.
Sometimes that can lead to the extending of life, but also highlights, tongue in cheek, the difficulty in setting how long a person has to live.
Right.
Because things can change the drop of a dime.
So
can't say drop of a penny anymore, because as we had our class a couple months ago, no more pennies.
So I'm sorry, Robert.
Yeah.
So just a kind of supporting your idea about you can't put the toothpaste back. Let the genie out of the bottle. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I forgot what metaphor you used, but so Canada has had an assisted suicide law on their books for some time, I think since maybe around 2017 or so. They call it MAID, medical assisted, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about that is it started off very slowly, but since has been, some people have cynically accused the government of promoting it and pushing people there, because Canada has socialized medicine, and people that are on long-term care cost the government a lot of money. And it has reached the point now where nearly, I think, 4.6 7%, nearly 5% of all deaths in Canada are this assisted suicide situation. So there's, once it's become law and once it becomes kind of socially or societally accepted, people think less of, it kind of cheapens the value of human life. And I think but that's the ethical and the societal. That's not necessarily the halachic things that you started.
Right, but I think that it is interesting, and again, a number of the Jewish reactions to this came out over the summer with some of the legal. But I think it's interesting to note, that Mervis and Brody, look, they're writing for a popular audience that's less moved or motivated or interested in the halakha conversations. But I think they're cognizant of the fact that it's such a deeply personal decision that making it about a specific chapter verse in Jewish law isn't enough, and that we have to move beyond that. Those who are more motivated and within that system religiously to accept the traditional Jewish view of the subject will do so. Those who are less so are also trying to present compelling arguments, and we'll see. I think that there's certainly a sympathy. The way that Louise raised the example before, there's a sympathy towards someone terminal, given a diagnosis, 6 months to live, no quality of life, and such. Those who face that directly and personally is very different than trying to transcend that with a more spiritual religious perspective. At the same time, setting up the guardrails and the boundaries so that society doesn't enter the slippery slope is where I think what you're pointing out in terms of what's happened in Canada, or some of the arguments against that we're seeing. Lonnie, you have your hand up. If you unmute and go.
I was trying to unmute. I'm so sorry. I keep hitting everything else. So just to expand on the moral issue, as it is, very often in New York, a lot of palliative care doctors will push towards let's call it a halakhically acceptable form of not continuing treatment if you're only prolonging that life and making it more miserable and not allowing the soul to leave. But there is this tremendous pressure from these palliative teams. And the danger, I guess, of a law like this might be morally that they would push it even further in that, oh, look, you're allowed to do this. Why are we extending this person's life? And it becomes an issue. And a person is allowed their quality, person is allowed to make that choice. But that tremendous pressure might just be very difficult.
Yeah, 100%. Look, in general, and again, it's my experience with doctors and hospitals is they're looking for resolution, and that resolution means discharge or departure, however it's going to be. And that's there's a business decision, and there are all sorts of competing variables and factors that make it harder. Now, none of that takes away, and I think we'll see that in the last source in a minute, from the emotion and the pressures that are faced, and as well as as Mervis pointed out, people will make the decisions that they face. Let the people make those decisions, but if you and I think you're pointing this out similar to Hirsch, if you open up that gate a little bit more, it becomes more dangerous. Phyllis,
I'll paint a picture for you verbally. My mother, Oliver Shalom, was in NYU Tisch Hospital, Erev Yom Kippur, Kol Nidra night, 3 p.m. She had terminal pancreatic cancer. They moved her to a private room. It was imminent. She was fully aware. I sang Avinu Malkeinu. She said, go home. And we went home and came home from shul, and the phone rang. And my mother was gone. A friend of ours saw her shortly before. He was in the hospital and spoke to her. I always felt they gave her an extra dose of morphine. And because if they had said she was, going to die, that day, etc., of course, I wouldn't have gone home. But I always felt this has been going on. The hospitals have always done this, and I don't know, and I really did not, seek out the medical records, etc. It was probably fudged anyway, but I'm sure that she got that extra dose. Whether she asked for it or not, I have no idea.
Sounds like the making of a miniseries, a dark television.
Except it's life, yeah. Except it's life.
No, but look, yeah, and I think there are different situations. We again, as we have seen, not to underestimate the very real personal trauma and pain that is felt. Sometimes we're talking about, people in situations of, who are in the prime of their life who are struck down by illnesses and the like. It's complicated.
Yes.
But to highlight that, while we can be sympathetic and sensitive, that doesn't necessarily mean that those who are opposing these laws. Remember, getting back to what Hochul said, that on the one hand she's a Catholic and she recognizes the opposition, but on the other, God is merciful. So, source number 11, something that Rabbi Josh Flug wrote back when Neil Gorsuch was nominated as a justice for the U.S. Supreme Court. Opponents of his nomination expressed a number of objections. Most of the objections are political in nature, but one of those objections should give us pause. In 2009, Gorsuch wrote a book called Assisted Suicide, which can be summed up by one sentence in the book. Human life is intrinsically valuable, and that intentional killing is always wrong. The objectors are bothered by the very term assisted suicide and prefer to be called death with dignity. Implicit message is that Gorsuch must be some sort of Neanderthal. He needs to get with the times and get on board with new cultural norms. Assisted suicide is just one example of the Torah being at odds with cultural norms. There are many others that makes it more challenging to connect with those who embrace those cultural norms. We can only hope that through our compassion and sensitivity, people can see that we are not mean-spirited, we truly care about compassionate results. And the idea that it's not necessarily popular or easy, or it doesn't feel so good to be on the other side of this. And I think that's also part of the motivation for Brody and Mervis and others, not to just look at this as black and white. Recognize the complexity, recognize the sensitivity, recognize that it's not just about the individual case. There's broader societal implications. It's broader messages about faith and about creation, about soul, and that those are also important variables that should strengthen our ability to oppose. And again, it's not just because God is merciful doesn't mean that doesn't make this right. That's the mussar I would give Kathy Hochul, and we'll have to see how all this plays out. But I think that ultimately our ubacharta b'chaim, choosing life, which is about the sanctity of life, and we do anything to save a life, and that also sometimes means life goes longer than we can understand why, but that doesn't mean that we interfere. And we'll see how this issue plays out in the coming weeks and tackle some other headlines upcoming.